Wolfgang Ischinger, good to have you back at the Institute.
Great to be here.
A reliable trustee, if I can just say that. Yeah. You gave a very interesting speech recently, and it comes at a time when Germany is putting itself together, the government, I mean, and there's going to be some new players over there. My tendency to think about what's going to come out on the coalition agreement is that the changes of parameters in German foreign policy are not going to be huge. So we can expect more of what we've seen heretofore, even though we will have a new foreign minister. We'll have the same chancellor, presumably the same finance minister. But what does that say about what you say in this speech that you gave on September 26th in Berlin, which you talked really about more expectations. You talked about expectations of Germany internationally. You're very insistent that Germany should do that. You cite Sikorsky saying, you know, Germany is the indispensable nation, but there are a lot of people who accuse Germany of being what the old Kissinger comment was, you know, an economic giant and a political dwarf. So what makes you think that what your suggestions here about Germany taking over more responsibility will fall on fertile ground in a new coalition?
Not much. But if I had thought that, you know, this was going to happen anyway, there would not have been a need to make that kind of speech. My assessment is, first of all, that you are absolutely right. The tendency in Berlin is more of the same. Mm. And I'm actually saying that in this speech. I think Germans have, over the last couple of decades, tended to fall in love with the status quo. The desire to change things in any fundamental or far-reaching way has gone to practically zero. Hmm. Germans do not enjoy the idea of more EU enlargement, for example. They also don't want to go back to the Denmark.
Right.
They don't want to be entangled too much. So the reluctance, or the, as to use a word that used very often by outgoing Foreign Minister Westerwelle, die Kultur der militärischen Zurückhaltung, this
reticence,
political military reticence, I think that falls on fertile ground. My point is, that's a correct assessment, but it fails to meet the expectations of our partners. Germany is today, undisputedly, the strong economic power among the 28 EU members. It runs the show in some ways. That's also a challenge. But I think part of the answer is that, given that that particular power that we have, we cannot possibly hide when things become rocky or difficult in international or regional security affairs. Germany needs to accept the fact, whether we like it or not, that we are going to be called upon to be one of the leaders. What would you expect small countries to do in terms of, you know, courageous action forward if the big guy decides to go on vacation? So I think this is really a well-reasoned argument which Radek Sikorsky made, and I was extremely pleased, you know, with all due respect to the German head of state, President Gauck, in his speech on the 3rd of October, in his more formal way of expressing things, actually said many of the things that I try to talk about in my own remarks. So I think what I'm trying to say here is not just something that I like to see. I believe that it is shared by an increasing number of people who think hard about what kind of role we should play, the kind of role we are playing, and how we can or should change that over the next period. And I think this, of course, is a decisive moment. If there is ever a moment where a government can determine to change certain things, it's always when you sign your coalition treaty. Are we going to go this way, or are we going to go that way, or are we going to do nothing about it? So this is why I thought in September and also in October, these are important moments.
I gather. The thing that really is interesting about it, when you get into the individual suggestions you make, it's interesting. You talk about the need, I think you say it, Germany should have a national security apparatus, and you don't have that, and historically. It's been held up by history, but you think it's time to move in that direction.
Oh, absolutely. Look, I mean, to put it in a colloquial fashion, the decision about a new traffic sign goes through more formal procedure in Germany than the decision to be part or not to be part of an international military or non-military mission. I believe that this was okay, the absence of a formal foreign policy and security decision-making process during the period when we were actually not really a sovereign nation, up until unification.
Right.
I believe that the last 20 years have shown that these decisions that we've had to take are, in fact, decisions about, often, unfortunately, about life and death of foreigners, but also of our own people, of our soldiers and of civilians. So I believe that it is important that we have a structure that is that provides for as systematic, a series of decisions that is also verifiable, and that brings together the entire government. The tendency, not only in Germany, by the way, also in other European countries, has been of concentrating foreign policy decision-making powers in the office of the head of government or head of state, depending on what system they have. Foreign ministers and foreign ministries have tended to become slightly more marginalized over the last period. That has to do with the Treaty of Lisbon and a few other factors. And that is why I believe the traditional German argument against a formal national security process created in the Chancellery, the old argument is no longer a valid one. The old argument was, if we do that, we give more power to the Chancellor in a coalition government with a coalition partner sitting in the foreign ministry. That's not a healthy situation, therefore, hands off. I believe in the current situation, the foreign ministry, the finance ministry, and other government departments that have to play a role in foreign policy and security decision-making, defense, obviously, development, they would all benefit if, through their participation in a formal structure where, like in the US national security process, you would have at the top a principals meeting, but prepared by the specialists from the various departments through a chain of, in a certainly more formalized procedure than is the case today. We have, in fact, that's the funny thing, Germany has a Bundessicherheitsrat, a National Security Council. Goes back to the 1960s. It exists, there are rules for it, but it is used almost exclusively for the purpose of determining arms export decisions. And it is not used in this formal sense for the kinds of decisions that really affect our nation. Should or should we not participate in Libya? Should or should we do something about Mali? Should we, what should be our role? Right. So I believe that we should follow, maybe not by the letter, but at least in terms of the philosophy, the example set by our British partners. The Brits didn't have a formalized national security procedure. They created one a few years ago. All my British friends tell me our decisions have become better. It works. So I'm not suggesting that everything will be fine if we do what the Americans are doing. I believe there are European models that we can maybe not copy word by word, but at least in principle.
Well, you also, that sort of ties together with another point you make, and that is about Europeanizing this process. And of course, you have a situation coming up next year where Lady Ashton, I think, will be stepping down. You have a new opportunity to put someone in that position. I'd almost think that you'd be a good candidate for that position. But let's talk about what is going to push Europe in the direction that you just described as good for Germany. Because if you're going to do it there at the national level, then obviously the next step is to pool it, and you talk about that. You know, you say that Europe has 40% in comparison to the United States of the capacity in the military, but you really don't get much bang for your buck. You can only do that if you do it on a European basis, but what stops you? Sovereignty, the problems of pooling it. Again, let me come back to my original question. You have a new government in Berlin. You're thinking that that might be fertile ground to lay these seeds out that you've just planted. What about in Europe? I mean, what's going to be the case for more efforts in that direction of creating really a European voice? And I think you want to see that.
Well, you're not going to create that overnight. It takes more than just one decision. But you need to start. My view is that the first thing we need is a piece of paper that describes the objective, that describes the method, and that describes the resources that the EU believes it should deploy, it can deploy, and for what purpose. For example, I have never seen a document that says that it is in the EU interest to have, say, an aircraft carrier or at least 3 frigates in the Mediterranean to make sure that pirates don't start bothering us in the Mediterranean. What about protection of the Baltic Sea or of the North Sea? What about the airspace? What are our military requirements as a group of 28 nations? You referred to the fact that through duplication of effort, every little nation has its own military structure, which is probably the worst in terms of efficient allocation of resources, the worst possible way of creating synergy effects. So I think the first thing is that hopefully we will have at least a mandate developed to write a European security strategy. Remember, a first effort, a great effort, coming out of left field, as you would say in this country, was done 10 years ago by Javier Solana. It was a security document in 2003. My friend, your friend, our friend Christoph Heusgen was one of the key authors of this document. That's not a strategy document in a formal sense, but it was at least a basis for that. Mm-hmm. Nothing has happened since. Mm-hmm. We wouldn't know. I bet you the EU ambassador in Beijing or in Brazil, wherever they are, if you ask him, what exactly is your mandate? What are you saying to the Chinese defense minister if he asks you what are the policy goals of the EU? We don't really know them. We haven't formulated them. I believe that's the first step. The second step is that we need to take some difficult decisions, which can only be taken at the very top, to organize our arms industry better. The fact of the matter is, poor Europe produces or uses 6 times more weapon systems than the much bigger United States. Again, the worst possible way of creating synergies, the best way of spending money in a bad way. So there's enormous room for improvement. Mm-hmm. Changing the situation is, I admit, enormously difficult. But I simply refuse to believe that it is impossible. If it were impossible, it would have been impossible to build what is today known as Airbus. If it were impossible, the French, the Germans, the Brits, and others would have each stuck to their own guns and produced their own aircraft. But some smart people, a generation or two ago, decided that the only way to compete successfully with Boeing and others in the world market is to pool our resources. So what I'm suggesting is simply that we go back to the drawing board, use the Airbus model as a wonderful, very successful model, and apply it to hopefully a number of other areas, an increasingly large number of areas of arms production. I think that's the way forward. And in that way, I believe, even without talking officially about a European army, with all the constitutional and legal implications of that, you can get a lot more bang for the buck and still retain the right of national parliaments to, as in the case of Germany, to make sure that no German soldier is going to be sent abroad without the consent and advice of the German parliament. Mm-hmm. So I think it can be done.
Okay, now let me turn to another question. We have obviously the new government coming up in Berlin. As you well know, and you know the United States very well, we're also going through a phase here where we're wondering what our constraints are going to be in the future. I think there's also maybe a strain here of what we both know is the isolationist tendencies returning. Has a lot to do with the economic unpredictability of things, and to some extent I think the lack of understanding about what our role is. In that sense, where do you say, you in particular on Germany, but maybe even in Europe as well, where is it that Europe, Germany can step up to the plate and take on responsibilities that would be enormously important to the United States at this point? I think one of them you already mentioned in this speech, and that is Russia. But maybe you can mention a few others. Where do we need you most, do you think?
Well, yes, Russia, working together to figure out a more harmonious way forward in terms of shaping the relationship with Russia, creating at least the basis for a Euro-Atlantic security architecture that works, because so far it hasn't really worked well enough. We have so many interests in common, the US, Russia, and the EU, but because of the well-known problems in the relationship, we have failed to exploit these commonalities of interest. So yes, that's one area. The other area that I see is, I believe that not only in the military sense, but also in a straightforward political sense, the European Union could provide enormous support to American long-term strategic objectives in the greater Middle East. I'm not overestimating European capabilities. I believe that only the United States can manage, or that we can manage the Iranian problem only with the United States. But it's also true the other way around. The United States can expect, and has a right to expect, that as the U.S. works on Israel-Palestine, as the U.S. works on terrorism in Somalia and in other parts of this region, as we try to figure out how to move forward on the Syrian catastrophe, more than just speeches from the EU, I believe would be most welcome in the United States, if I'm not mistaken. So that is why I'm saying, if we could demonstrate to the US that we're going to have, we, the EU, permanently a certain military and political presence in the greater Mediterranean area, that we will help the US carry the ball, not just by way of speeches and diplomatic visits, but by real action. And I'm not talking about military intervention at all. As you know, in foreign policy, of course facts matter, but sometimes perceptions matter just as much. as facts. And we are living at a time when perceptions in that region have been the Europeans are absent, you can discount them, they're not doing a thing, and the Americans are probably leaving. So there is a sense of uncertainty in the region, and I think that Europe can make a meaningful difference and make sure that the United States is not going to be left alone carrying the ball, not only in the Mediterranean, but in the Far East and in other parts of the world. That's not going to work anymore. And therefore, our job is to be really, not only in words, but in deeds, a partner for the United States.
And that remains, if I'm not mistaken, Wolfgang, a fairly broad consensus in whatever government comes to power in Berlin. In other words, you know, if we talk now about whether there's going to be a black-red coalition or whether there's going to be a black-green coalition, when you think about what you said at the end just now, isn't that something that's a fairly broad consensus, or do you worry about that?
I worry about it because, and I was really concerned when I saw television pictures a few weeks ago from Paris, where President Hollande had invited not only his own foreign minister, Fabius, but John Kerry and the British foreign secretary to discuss Syria. You know, for almost 50 years we've had, as a kind of a small group, to not to run, but to help shape Western foreign and security policy. We've had this group of four. It existed throughout the 70s and 80s in the Cold War, and it has existed since. This is the first time that I can remember that the group of four did not exist anymore. Why did it not exist anymore? Because my own government had chosen not to be involved in more than speeches in the Syrian matter. And I think that's not good enough. I think we need to be there. I'm not suggesting that we are the country that's going to be able to solve the situation, but I think we need to make a serious effort to contribute to security in Europe and beyond.
Well, I think that one of the things that we'll see, regardless of what the government is, I think a continuation of this process. One of the concerns that I have on this side of the ocean is the ability to keep up the expectations. There are some people who could say Europe will never get their act together, you know, and it's going to be a one-on-one situation with the Brits or maybe with the French in terms of expeditionary forces. Germany is always going to be out there somewhere else. We have a bit of a responsibility, it seems to me, here too, to figure out what we can do to enhance or at least encourage you to do that. I think at the end of the day, though, I think my point to you earlier was we're going through a pretty serious discussion now about what we can and cannot do. And that opens a door, just like you want to open a door to your new government and say, look, here's an opportunity to think about new parameters. I think we have to think about new parameters because it's not, the world is not like it was in 1990 or even the year 2001, certainly. And so at the end of the day, I think what we're hoping for, at least we work here at the Institute on this, is this dialogue about not only burden sharing, but also power sharing and responsibility sharing. And I think that's where we have to go.
Absolutely. And let me just echo this. I think that actually the Syrian situation, as it has evolved over the last couple of months, may turn out to be an almost historic moment where things can come together in a better way, both in terms of how the West works with Russia again. All of a sudden, we seem to be able to talk to each other again and take decisions. But also, within the West, I think there is now a sense that, okay, the Germans were not really willing about talking about military force. Yeah, but on the other side, our British friends were talking maybe too wildly about the application of military force without thinking that they wanted to have a vote in their own parliament, which was then not a positive one. So I think that this is actually a useful moment to rethink how together we are going to address these issues in the future, hopefully not as single nation states, but through a strong voice in Brussels. And that's my final comment. I would strongly urge European leaders, including certainly my own future incoming government, to make sure that the absolute best and brightest are going to be selected for the leadership positions at the European level. I think that's not only something we owe to ourselves, it's also something we owe to our partners, including especially the United States. We need leadership at the top of the EU that is capable of meeting the raised expectations that exist today in the world.
Well, I would make sure that your phone is available for perhaps a phone call in that direction, Mr. Ischinger. You never know when it might come to you. Anyway, we say in German, wir danken für das Gespräch. Thank you very much, sir. Good to see you again.
Thanks. Thanks.